The Bowline Mesh Stitch is a stitch pattern I came up with for my Monotype bag. And I created this mesh pattern after swatching a lot of knitted mesh patterns. It's very possible someone else has already made a stitch pattern like this or one very similar. I'm very fond of Elizabeth Zimmerman's term unvented for knitted things because generally I think there's only so much you can do with 2 sticks and string and the same kind of toolbox or library of stitch patterns. So it's very possible that someone else has already created this stitch pattern. But I came up with it because I really wanted a mesh pattern that was both stable, it wouldn't stretch dramatically or kind of lose its integrity, and that didn't have a strong tendency to bias. A lot of knitted meshes tend to lean in one direction and this bag is knitted in the round, and that would kind of create a twisted effect that I definitely didn't want. And I wanted a really symmetrical appearance, and I chose to have I suppose a diagonal lattice arrangement rather than a grid. So every row of holes is like centered between the holes on the row below. So this is the Bowline mesh. I'm going to show you how to knit it in the round. I haven't used it flat. I did swatch it flat a little bit. But if you are interested in knitting it flat, let me know and maybe I can come up with some instructions and a tutorial for that. But at the moment, it's knit in the round in the bag pattern, so I'm going to show you how to knit it in the round. You need a multiple of 4 stitches, so I've got 60, but you could vary that. I just wanted a number that I could kind of easily work magic loop with. And I found that this stitch pattern works better on a needle a couple of sizes larger than you would usually use for the yarn. So I'm working this stitch pattern on a 5.5mm needle with a fairly heavy DK light worsted weight cotton yarn. These decreases might be a little bit different than ones you've worked before. I'm going to be decreasing 4 stitches into just 1. So to do that, I'm going to slip my first 2 stitches knitwise and then knit 2 together, making sure I'm using my working end of the yarn. And then I'm going to pass both slip stitches again together over the resulting stitch. So I've got 4 stitches, decrease just down to 1, and then I'm going to work a yarn over and repeat. So slip 2 together, knit 2 together, pass slip stitches over. Because of the big needles and the dramatic decreases, these yarn overs will probably look a bit bigger than a yarn over might look if you were just doing yarn over knit together. That is absolutely fine. If anything, it's what you want. So continue yarn over, slip 2 together, knit 2 together, pass slip stitches over. I'm going to continue like that to the end of the round. For round 2, I'm going to knit the sort of resulting stitches of my decreases, and I'm going to effectively add a second strand to my yarn overs. So I'll show you how to do that. So I'm going to knit 1, then I'm going to make another yarn over on my right needle tip by bringing the yarn to the front between the needles and then to the back over the needles. And then I'm going to slip my original yarn over purlwise. And when I go to knit the next stitch, so knit 1, you can see that my new yarn over, which is here, is following the same path around the needle as my original yarn over. And I'm going to continue like that. So knit 1, yarn over, slip the original yarn over, knit the next stitch. And really the motion for making my yarn over on this round is to bring the yarn to the front, kind of hold it almost at the front, slip the original yarn over, and then knit 1, which will naturally just let the yarn follow the original path of my yarn over. that motion might be familiar to you if you've worked brioche. So yarn over, slip one, knit one. So continue like that all the way around. For round 3, I'm going to knit my knit stitches, and then I'm going to knit into both strands of my yarn overs. So I'm going to treat this kind of double-stranded yarn over as one stitch now, and I'm going to knit into it. So just through the center of that hole, knit and slip both strands off. Knit one, knit into both yarn over strands together, knit one, knit into both yarn over strands together. Don't worry if your yarn overs seem to be making some extra loops on the back. I've got a bit of looseness here. That's all going to kind of even out when you continue, because at the moment we've effectively got half of our original stitch count on the needles, and on the next row we're going to build that back up to our original stitch count. Continue in that way to the end of the round. For round 4, we're going to build back up to our original stitch count by adding an extra stitch to kind of each knit stitch and each yarn over. So start with the knit stitch, and what I'm going to do here is a special increase where I'm going to knit into the stitch below the stitch on my left needle. So this is the stitch on the left needle, this is the stitch below, and I'm going to go straight through that from front to back and then treat it like knitting a regular stitch. So pull a loop through, and then I'm going to knit into my original stitch on the needle. So I've made 2 stitches out of 1 here, and then I'm going to knit into the hole made by my yarn overs. So through the center of that hole, wrap the yarn, pull the loop through, and then I'm going to slip the stitch that's already knit through my yarn overs that we worked on the previous round. I'm going to slip that stitch purlwise, keeping the yarn at the back, and then I'm going to repeat that whole sequence. So knit into the stitch below the stitch on my left needle, so that's here, pull a loop through, knit into the stitch, so I've made 2 stitches out of 1, knit into the hole from the yarn overs, slip the stitch, and then again knit into the stitch below the next stitch, knit the next stitch into both yarn overs, slip the stitch, and continue in that way until the end of the round. The stitch pattern has an 8-row repeat where effectively rows 5 to 8 are the same as rows 1 to 4 or rounds 1 to 4, but offset. So to make that offset happen, at the end of round 4, I'm going to knit 1. If I've got an end of round marker, which I don't have here because I'm doing magic loops, so my end of round is kind of between the needles. If I had an end of round marker, I would just take it off, set it to one side, and then I'm going to knit what was the first stitch of this round. And then that's going to be my new end of round. So for magic loop, I'm going to pull my needle out. That's going to hang out there. And then a good way to double check that you're in the right position for starting round 5 is if you look at the first 4 stitches, the kind of center 2 should be coming out of that big yarn over hole. And then round 5 is very similar to round 1. But in this case, I'm going to work yarn over and then my S2 K2P decrease. So let's start with the yarn over, and then I'm going to do slip 2 together, knit 2 together, pass those slip stitches over. And just to double check everything looks right, I've got my sort of decreases pulling together, the stitches coming out of the yarn over and 1 stitch on either side. So that decrease should be centered directly above the yarn overs from the previous kind of set of rounds. So yarn over, slip 2 together, knit 2 together, and then pass the slip stitches over. I find I really need to give those a bit of a little jerk to open things up to be able to pass those over. Yarn over, slip 2 together, knit 2 together, pass the slip stitches over, and continue like that until the end of the round. Round 6 is very similar to round 2, so I'm going to slip my original yarn overs and add a new yarn over to join them and knit my knit stitches. So I'm going to start by bringing my yarn to the front over the needle, slip 1, knit 1. So I've got a new yarn over following the same path. I'm going to continue like that to the end of the round. And this stitch pattern works best if you make sure on this round that your new yarn overs have kind of the same amount of yarn in them as your original ones. Without the decreases, it'll be easier to pull everything tighter on this round. So I try to keep everything nice and open on my right needle to make sure I'm not really tightening up these yarn overs and losing the lovely big open work holes. So try and keep the amount of yarn, the sort of tension on those yarn overs matching the previous round. Round 7 again is basically the same as round 3. I'm going to knit into each of my yarn overs, my sort of doubled yarn over, and knit into each knit stitch. So knit into that yarn over hole, split off the needle, knit 1. Knit into the yarn overs, knit 1, and continue in that way to the end of the round. Round 7 is basically the same as round 3. I'm going to knit into each of my double-stranded yarn overs and knit the knit stitches. So knit into the yarn overs, knit 1. Knit into the yarn overs, knit 1. And again, you don't want to make this round really, really tight and kind of pull everything together. I'm just going to continue doing my knit into my yarn overs, knit 1 to the end of the round. I'm sure it's no surprise that round 8 is basically round 4. I'm going to knit into the hole for my yarn overs, slip the stitches I knit into the yarn overs in the last round, and then increase into my knit stitches. So start with knitting into the yarn overs. Just slip the next stitch with the yarn in back. And then I'm going to knit into the stitch below the one on my left needle tip. So into the stitch here all the way through front to back, pull a loop through, and then knit the stitch. And into the hole from the yarn overs, slip 1, knit into the stitch on the row below, knit 1. And continue like that again until the end of the round. At the end of round 8, you'll have just one stitch left. And I'm going to knit into the stitch below that stitch, as I've been doing, and leave the stitch on the left needle. And then to begin round 1, you want to reset to where the original end of round was, which means this stitch is going to be the first stitch of round 1, and this stitch here will become the final stitch of round 8. If you have an end of round marker in place, your marker will be after this stitch, sort of here, and to kind of get that off, I would just slip this stitch here to my right needle, take the marker out, slip it back to my left needle, put the marker back in place, and you're ready to start round 1. Here where I'm doing magic loop, I'm just going to rearrange my stitches on my needles so that that stitch becomes my first stitch of round 1. And just like we did after round 4, you can double check that your AOR, your end of round, is in the right place by looking at the first 4 stitches. So my first 4 stitches here have my center 2 stitches are the 2 stitches that come out of the yarn over, and then on either side I have a stitch coming out of a knit stitch. And it doesn't matter at all that we didn't actually work this particular stitch in round 8. When we do the decrease at the beginning of round 1, you'll never notice that. Whether you use the Bowline Mesh Stitch on my Monotype bag pattern or on a project of your own design, I'd love to see what you make. Share on Instagram, you can tag me as Ysolda, or leave a comment down below to let me know how you got on or if you have any questions. And don't forget to subscribe for more knitting tutorials and patterns.